Hello and welcome to Epiphytic Cacti. Today let's take a look at Rhispalis ewaldiana. Now, Rhispalis ewaldiana has a pretty fascinating history. Basically, it was first described in 1995, and it was described from a plant that was only found in cultivation. So, if we go to the new Cactus Lexicon by David Hunt and read the description, the distribution says Brazil, provenance uncertain, but perhaps Rio de Janeiro, Sierra dos, or Gauss. No idea if I said that right. And then it goes on to basically say that the branch segments are dimorphic, growth of primary axis indeterminate, 4-angled, less than 60 centimeters by 4 to 5 millimeters. Laterals determinate, 3 to 6 centimeters only, mostly 3-angled. Flowering laterally on lateral segments, reddish in bud, 14 to 20 millimeters in diameter at the anthesis. White within, the fruit is 8 millimeters in diameter, and it is pinkish colored. Now, I have actually seen the fruit, pictures of the fruit on this be pinkish and then be extremely, extremely magenta. So what happened here is when this was found in cultivation and they described it, they were describing the Rhispalis ewaldiana clone most likely on the left. That is most likely the type or isotype clone, meaning the specific species that was initially described. Because it was only found in cultivation, it would have been presumed that there was only one clone of this ever. And so that created a lot of confusion, especially in the United States, where we have plants like on the left, the middle one is very green, and then the furthest most right one is like kind of very bright green, almost neon, really. Even though those plants share this kind of dimorphic growth habit, it was very difficult to try to call them Rhispalis ewaldiana. And for me, it was specifically very difficult because I had seen pictures of flowers of these all over the place, and they looked nothing alike when I saw the pictures. And this is where things are kind of fun because pictures seem to be very misleading when it comes to this. What ended up happening in 2018 is an article came out, and the article that came out in Phytotaxa, and the title of the article is Rediscovery of Rhipsalis ewaldiana. It's by Barthlott and N.P. Taylor. Notes of morphology and conservation of an endemic and threatened species from the Brazil Atlantic forest. So it's interesting because this species is it's very endangered and it only grows in one place. So this article goes on to basically describe how they found this. They found it growing in this park, and the description in the article was extremely fascinating because the description actually has the plants as being green and the fruit as being white. Now we can get into an interesting topic, how plants can change depending on where they're growing and just sort of like clone differences, right? Because it turns out that all three of the plants that are pictured here are Rhispalis ewaldiana. And what we're looking at appears to just be clone variation. Were the two plants on the right, did they somehow evolve from the type? Possibly. In my opinion, it just seems more likely that more clones ended up in the United States through some other means and just were not really, identified correctly when they came. I think that I did like the old video about Rhispalis sulcata, which got really messed up because unfortunately Rhispalis sulcata's botanical description had it that it had white berries. And because we didn't believe that these green Rhispalis ewaldianas were Rhispalis ewaldiana, they got misplaced and ended up falling under this identification of Rhispalis sulcata because I don't know who did it, but I do know that a nursery, like a sort of mass production plant place, sort of mass produced Rhispalis ewaldiana under the name Rhispalis sulcata and distributed it quite widely. And these were these green clones. So where they got their plants from, I have absolutely no idea. But I do know that these green clones have been around for quite a while. And for quite a while, they have been called Rhispalis sulcata. But they're not. They're Rhispalis ewaldiana. You can watch the Rhispalis sulcata video for more information about that. But how does this happen? Like, how do we end up with some Rhispalis ewaldiana, which have darker green coloration, they have a reddish on their branches, they have pinkish flowers, or can have pinkish flowers, and pink berries, while the ones on the right are just generally green with more white flowers, although the one on the very far right still has kind of pinkish flowers, or can be kind of pinkish flowers, and white berries. So, like, how exactly does this actually happen? Well, depending on growing conditions, if you had like the plant on the left, the one that is kind of pinkish, what has happened is that it's been growing in a higher light kind of environment for probably an extended period of time, that particular clone. And what'll happen is that the plant will evolve to protect itself from very high light by producing chemicals called betalains. And basically that's responsible for creating kind of like these red or purplish, what we perceive as purplish pigments in the plant branches, in the berries, etc. And the plants on the right-hand side, what's really interesting is the one that's in the center, it actually has the shorter branchlets, they can be 3-angled, and quite frequently I will find 2-angled ones. And so what's happened is they're a little bit fatter and they kind of flatten. And so that plant has been growing in a place where there hasn't been as much light. So what it's actually done is it's kind of shortened its growth to keep it up a little bit higher, and its branchlets are generally more robust. They're generally thicker and sometimes flat. And the reason why is because it can capture more light that way for photosynthesis, whereas the one on the left didn't need to do that. And then the one to the very far right, you have the same thing, as the one in the middle, where it's basically kind of stopped growing quite so pendant. That will eventually get pendant, but it tends to be very, very stout and it tends to have much sort of thicker branchlets, and its sort of primary branches, they are generally shorter. So what's gone on with that one is, obviously it's adapted to keep itself more upright. It's widened all of its growth so that it can photosynthesize better in a lower light environment. And well, that's just fascinating, right? So what we're seeing is really kind of like the initial steps towards evolution, which I think is really, really freaking cool, to be able to see that. And what's really interesting is that there's another article that's out there called The Neotypification of Rhipsalis rhombea. That article was published in Hazletonia by the Cactus and Succulent Society of America. I purchased this article from Bio One Complete, but it's a really, really interesting article in that they basically reinstated Rhipsalis rhombea back to species status and gave it a proper description. And they even show pictures of the plants that most of us would have had in our collections that are Rhipsalis rhombea. But the other really interesting thing about it is that they did some of the phylogenetic analysis and found that Rhipsalis ewaldiana forms what I believe is called a sister group with Rhipsalis rhombea. And essentially what that means is that they both evolved from the same plant, essentially. So like they evolved into two specific species out of one species, which is extremely fascinating. And what's super interesting is that Rhipsalis rhombea has these same curious characteristics. The flowers between these two are very, very similar if you compare them. And it tends to have these same characteristics or same types of clones, where some of the clones, they have that real strong reddish outline around their clades. They tend to have a little bit more pinkish flowers. And then you'll end up with, there is a green clone of Rhispalis rhombea, which produces white berries. So that's pretty fascinating. And outside of that, back just like a little bit further, you find that Rhispalis Ewaldiana, Rhispalis rhombea, and Rhispalis goebeliana all ended up evolving from the same species. And that's why they share such curious, strong similarities. Now, goebeliana, it's not in the sister group. It actually forms a clade, which is defined by what I just said. However, for Rhispalis goebeliana, Rhispalis ewaldiana, and Rhispalis rhombea are its closest relatives. And with Rhispalis goebeliana, you see the same thing. It has a very, very similar sort of flower, and you see clones that share these traits with Rhispalis ewaldiana. You have a very bright green clone. You have clones that are more reddish. You have clones that are more of a, solid greenish color. And again, you see this variation in the berries. So one thing that I definitely learned from all of this is not to actually totally trust the botanical descriptions when it comes to the berries, especially when we see things like, like reddish or pinkish berries and then whitish berries, because there are other species that do this exact same thing. Rhispalis terris is a really good example of that. And I personally can attest to having seen a color shift in the berries for Rhispalis terris form prismatica with my own eyes. I had berries that formed indoors that ended up having kind of a like whitish color to them. And then they were more of just a whitish color. And then I had berries that formed outdoors that ended up having a little bit more of a pinkish color to them. Now, the reason why that kind of thing can happen is actually because that plant is already capable of producing betalains. And so if you put it in high light, it will just start producing those betalains. And if you move it to lower light, it won't really produce those betalains quite as readily. Which is really funny because a lot of times in pictures, and this is kind of fascinating, a lot of times in pictures, if you take a picture of a Rhispalis flower that has formed under kind of lower light conditions, it will tend to have less color in it. And if you take a Rhispalis flower that has formed under much higher light conditions, it will tend to have a much stronger color. I've also seen that with Rhispalis terris. I've seen the ovaries turn red. I've seen the plant, which normally produced white flowers, maybe a little bit yellowish, start producing more pinkish flowers. So that's just kind of an interesting note there. Is sometimes with pictures, you don't always just want to believe your eyes, And I also found this really fascinating in terms of just sort of understanding like phylogenetics and how much just sort of seeing those phylogenetic analysis can help us figure out whether the Rhispalis that we have are ID'd correctly or not. And the reason why is because of how closely related they are and the characteristics in the flowers. It's typically in the flowers. You do see it in the plants, but typically it's going to be more readily visible in the flowers. And the reason why that is because flowers are reproductive parts. So one of the other really cool things that I ended up finding was these field guides. So I found these really amazing field guides. It was like, wait a second, I've never seen this before. So on this website called fieldguides.fieldmuseum.org, you can actually find what are essentially field guides for identifying plants that grow in specific areas. And There are several on there. Like if you just search for Cactaceae, you'll find a bunch, but one of them that's extremely interesting is the state of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, Cactaceae of Rio de Janeiro. One of the people that it looks like helped create this field guide is this person named Alice Calvente. I have no idea if I said her name right, but she's published a lot of articles about Cactaceae and has, participated in a lot of those or produced a lot of those phylogenetic studies. So I think that's pretty fascinating. This particular version of this field guide was published on August 2022. And what was extremely fascinating is there are a ton of pictures in there of a ton of different species, but one of the pictures or a grouping of pictures that is actually in this field guide is of Rhipsalis ewaldiana, a totally green clone growing in the wild in Brazil. And it's got pictures of the flowers and it has pictures of white berries. So I thought that was pretty fascinating because it took me a really long time to try to confirm that Rhipsalis ewaldiana could have white berries, right? It just was, I knew that this was true about Rhipsalis terris. I knew it was true about some of the other larger flat-clade Rhipsalis, but I feel like because of the kind of strange history of Rhipsalis ewaldiana only really being found in cultivation, it made it really difficult to try to confirm that, even though it seemed very likely that those green clones were Rhipsalis ewaldiana. So I think we can all rest easy now and change all of our labels on these green Rhipsalis ewaldiana looking plants. So I want to take a closer look at these flowers. Another thing that I really learned from a lot of this is that, the morphology of the plants, the coloring on the plants, the coloring on the flowers, all of those types of things, they will lie to you. They will tell you things like these can't be the same species. But the one thing that never really seems to lie to you is the flowers. And it's really the fine details in the flowers. So we're talking about overall kind of appearance, but also these fine details. How did this flower form? What was the bud formation for this? How many petals does it have? Which can be variable, actually, and it is on Ewaldiana. What I've seen on Ewaldiana is anywhere between, I think, 5, 6, maybe even up to 7 petals. And it seems more prevalent on some clones than it is on other clones. The ovary shape, how long is the ovary, the number of stamen, the overall appearance of the stamen, the stigma lobes, which can also be variable. So you're talking about overall appearance and fine detail and just ignoring general sort of flower color and in some cases flower size, because sometimes the flowers are just bigger or smaller on some clones. This kind of more stout, real bright green clone, it does carry these sort of pinkish flowers. They are a little bit more yellowish. And one of the interesting things is that it quite commonly will have 6 visible petals instead of 5 visible petals, more frequently than the other plants. But I have found flowers on all of them that look similar to that, but it seems to kind of carry a stronger floral relationship with Rhipsalis rhombea, which quite commonly has more, 5, 6, 7, 8 visible petals. So it seems to kind of somehow share more floral traits with rhombea than the other two. And, typically all of the flowers across all of them, they were just very similar. I think the very, very green clone had the least sort of pinkish flowers. There was still some pink in there, but generally they look to be a little bit more of kind of like a greenish or a yellowish color, which you could see in the field guides, the flowers were considerably more yellow. and they weren't really quite as pink. So that's just kind of our overview here of these really interesting floral traits. I hope that you've enjoyed looking at Rhipsalis ewaldiana with me. Thank you for watching, and happy cacti growing.